Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, on this podcast, over the last 5 years, we've had all the big names in tech, such as Sony, Microsoft, IBM, along with a few celebrities along the way too, such as William Shatner, Wendy Williams, and football teams such as Man United and Real Madrid. But at the heart of this podcast, it has always been about how technology works best when it brings people together and solves real problems. So if you are an individual, a listener of this show, small startup or a big business, if you've got an example of how tech is doing just that, there is always a seat for you on this podcast and platform to share your voice and your story. Essentially, that is what this podcast is all about. And when I heard that Allan Cole was diagnosed with young-onset Parkinson's disease 5 years ago at the age of 48, and subsequently attempted to turn that negative into a positive by starting PDWise, a blog and community hub aimed at telling stories, providing education and building community among those living with Parkinson's as well as their loved ones, I felt compelled to ask him to come on the podcast today. And thankfully he said yes. And he's published a wide range of books on lessons from Parkinson's disease. And regular listeners will also know this is a subject close to my heart because my dad had Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia. And after having displayed a few symptoms myself, I too have undergone all the tests, and including an MRI scan. And I've spoke to a few listeners of this show that are on a similar journey too. And I'm also very conscious we will have people listening in 165 countries who might run a search after being diagnosed and find themselves searching for answers. And maybe they have a few misconceptions about the disease. And they end up at this very episode. So with all that in mind, I invited Allan Cole on the podcast today to discuss Parkinson's, which is, yes, progressive, and currently there is no cure. But there is so much to be hopeful for. And as this is a tech podcast, I want to also learn more about the role that Allan sees that technology is playing in helping people. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Austin, Texas, where Allan is waiting to speak with us now. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Well, thank you, Neil, for having me. I appreciate what you do, and it's an honor to be here today. I'm Allan Cole. I live in Austin, Texas, and married, have two teenage daughters. I serve as Deputy to the President for Societal Challenges and Opportunities at the University of Texas at Austin, and also as a professor in the Steve Hicks School of Social Work.
Well, as regular listeners will know, Austin is a place very close to my heart, so it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. But I've got to ask, can you share your origin story, where your passion for technology came from, and what put you on this path you're on right now?
Yeah, like a lot of people, I love video games as a kid, and I was a child of the 70s. So, my first exposure to video games was Pong and Atari and rudimentary handheld devices from Mattel. They had an American football game that every kid wanted. And then I got a first computer in college, much later than my kids got their first computer. It was a Macintosh that sort of was a box shape that sat on the desktop. And then for a lot of years, I was an avid consumer of technology. But really, my interest was honed about 5 years ago when I was diagnosed with young-onset Parkinson's disease at the age of 48. And now I have a much deeper passion for technology for a variety of reasons, which I hope we can get into today.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to learning more about that in just a moment. But before we do, you were talking there about your passion for technology and where it came from and from being a kid. I think we must be roughly the same age because I went through that exact same journey from Pong and Atari. And
yeah.
Do you remember the Tomy headset that you held up to your eyes? That was way before virtual reality.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, that was the precursor, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, man.
My kids laugh when I talk about these, and some of these retro games are available, and I show them to them, and they're not impressed. But I still am impressed.
Yeah, you and me both. And on the topic of Parkinson's, for people listening that might be unfamiliar or have perceptions about it, can you tell listeners a little bit more about Parkinson's disease and the challenges of what having Parkinson's brings?
Sure. Well, Parkinson's is a movement disorder. It's a neurologic condition, progressive and neurodegenerative, so it doesn't get better over time. It gets worse. The rate of progression is different for everyone, as is the degree of depression progression. But it's it's a chronic illness that has to be managed pretty intentionally over a long period of time. What it does is it ultimately affects your ability to move. It happens because you lose neurons or nerve cells in your brain that produce a chemical called dopamine, a neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter is responsible for all kinds of bodily movements as well as your mood. So people with Parkinson's are challenged to move, whether that's with their legs or their hands or their body more generally, but also can experience significant depression and anxiety. About 40 to 50% of people with Parkinson's will struggle with anxiety, and a little more than that will struggle with depression. So it has both what we call motor skills, which are kind of the known ones: tremor, slowness of movement, problems with your gait, et cetera, but also non-motor symptoms, which are things like depression, anxiety, constipation, things like that.
And as we spoke about before we started recording the podcast today, my father had Parkinson's, so I know all the signs to kind of look for, and I know what he went through, etc. But although this is an audio podcast, I'm looking at you now, and I would have no idea that you've got Parkinson's. And as this is a tech podcast, I am seeing significant advances in technology that can prevent visible signs such as shaking. But have you seen the role of technology making it easier for yourself and fellow sufferers of Parkinson's?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the exciting things in the Parkinson's community right now is the many contributions that are being made by technology in different forms. Everything from apps that help you stay on schedule with your medications, and people with Parkinson's have to take a lot of medication, and the longer they live with it, the more medications they typically have to take. Also, apps for exercise, very important for Parkinson's. It's the only thing that we know can slow progression. So vigorous, regular exercise is a must. Wearable technologies that you're alluding to are being developed, and there are prototypes out there already that can significantly reduce tremors in one's hands, for example. I've seen people who cannot write when they're not wearing a wearable technology because their tremors are so significant, and then when they wear them, they can write as you or I might write. There are also lots of advances in what we call deep brain stimulation. It's been around for a number of decades, but it's getting better every few months, it seems like. That's when they implant electrodes in your brain. It's brain surgery, but then an electric current moderates some of your symptoms, whether it be tremor or rigidity or what we call bradykinesia, which is slowness of movement. That's getting better and better each day. And then more recently, a new technology that's called focused ultrasound, and it's guided by MRI, but there's more and more advances being made in non-invasive sort of interventions that may someday be a substitute for DBS, which is, again, brain surgery and is invasive. So on the medical front, all that's happening. And then, not to be lost in this is the ways that technology helps people in the community stay connected to one another. Parkinson's can be very isolating. A lot of people struggle with isolation who have Parkinson's. And so whether it's blogs or social media, other kinds of ways of connecting through technology, that's getting better and better each day as well. So I tell people the two frontiers for hope with Parkinson's are pharmacology and technology. And certainly technology is booming right now.
And although this is a tech podcast, I'm very passionate about learning more about the human stories and how technology is helping people. So how do you cope with living with this illness, and how has technology made it easier for you?
Well, honestly, my confidence in innovation is one of the things that spurs my hope. Being connected with others who live with Parkinson's and who work on Parkinson's from the research side or the medical side. All of that helps me find meaning and purpose in living with this illness. Also provides me with practical tips for how to manage things that we all have to manage in one way or another. Sharing our experiences, really important. I have written a lot about this on my blog and in some of my books. I spent about a year after my diagnosis in the Parkinson's closet. Nobody knew about it. My wife knew, and my doctors knew, of course, and one or two close friends who were in the medical community. But my parents didn't know, my children didn't know, my colleagues, closest circle of friends didn't know. That was extraordinarily painful. And looking back, I wish I had talked about it sooner than I did, because it was a period of suffering and silence. And technology, among other things, of course, has really helped me and other people connect with one another in ways that we find meaningful and find helpful for coping with this illness.
And one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today as well is I was doing a bit of research on you, and I read that you distinguish between having the disease and living with an illness, and two very important distinctions there. But can you expand on that and what you mean by that?
Disease is important. And I always tell people, we want people focused on disease. We want bench scientists and researchers and certainly clinicians focused on disease, because that's what needs to be treated scientifically. But illness is a person's sort of qualitative experience of living with the disease, if you will. And so if you know anything about Parkinson's, you know that we call it a snowflake disease, or a disease of one, which means that, there are clusters of symptoms, let's say, 12 or 15 symptoms that are more or less typical for Parkinson's. Nobody gets every symptom. You sort of get your 3 or 4 or 5 that are prominent. But there are degrees of those and distinctions and nuances in those. And so it becomes really important to listen to people's own subjective experience of the objective illness, if you will. And I really try to hit that chord with physicians and other healthcare providers that I am privileged to speak with, because it's easy, and I know this because I have lots of friends in the medical community, it's easy, even by well-intentioned practitioners, to objectify disease so that one can study it and treat it. But it's also easy, if we're not careful, to objectify the people who are living with that disease, i.e. living with an illness. And so I think words matter. And so I really try to speak as often as I can in terms of Parkinson's as a chronic illness, as well as a progressive disease.
And is there anything that surprised you about having Parkinson's? And are there any myths or misconceptions that maybe frustrate you that we can lay to rest today too?
Yeah, I've been surprised by a lot of things, and surprisingly, for the good. I've been surprised by how much having an illness like Parkinson's can teach a person. Surprised by how happy and content one can be with a progressive disease. I'm surprised daily by how brave and resourceful and kind and funny people who are living with Parkinson's are. Really surprised by how good my own life has become by virtue of having Parkinson's. I'm not saying that I would sign up for it or that it's good to have Parkinson's, but I've been, pleasantly surprised by how much meaning and beauty and joy and opportunity that having this illness has brought to me. Some of the myths that I appreciate the opportunity to dispel are that it's not a death sentence. People with Parkinson's have essentially the same life expectancy as people who don't have Parkinson's. It's true that as one lives longer with Parkinson's, the complications get more complicated and can get trickier and cause, significant health concerns. But it's not a death sentence. It's not the end of one's life professionally or socially or relationally, or doesn't have to be. And it's not only a disease that old people get. Like a lot of people, I thought Parkinson's was just an old person's disease, but lots of us are diagnosed in our 20s, 30s, or as in my case, in our 40s. More and more people are being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, by the way, about 60,000 people annually in the US alone. About 10 million people worldwide live with Parkinson's, and about 1 million in the US. But those numbers are growing. And so it's important to, know that and to continue to work on finding better treatments and cures, but also to know that more and more are going to be affected by it in their daily lives.
And I'm so grateful that you've just shared that there, because I'm quite conscious we're going to have people listening all over the world, and they may be regular listeners that are just listening for tech trends and things, and they know a family member or maybe themselves has been recently diagnosed. But I'm also conscious that there could be people that have just literally been diagnosed. They've searched on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, come across this episode, listening to hear what's in store for them, etc., what they can expect. So it's so important to get a positive message like that out there, isn't it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Neil. And again, it's hard for a lot of us in the community to talk about this, especially early on, and especially, when we're younger, I think, because we, to whatever extent we expect to get a chronic illness, and most of us don't, I suspect, we certainly don't expect to get something like Parkinson's as a younger person. But whatever our age, and I know lots of older, folks who have it and got it at a later age too. It's always a shock. None of us expect to have this experience, and so trying to normalize it, if you will, to the extent that we can, to educate people, to raise awareness, to let folks who are newly diagnosed know that they're not alone, and there's a big and growing community that has its arms out, ready to embrace them. All of that's really important.
And of course, Parkinson's is progressive, and currently there isn't a cure. But what is it that gives you hope, and what role do you say technology and continuously playing in helping people? Because there is so much going on in this area at the moment, is it? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of news around different treatments and technology, and like, as I mentioned earlier about the preventing shakes, etc. There's a lot to be excited about too, isn't there?
There's an awful lot, Neil, and I tell people, somewhat humorously, but it's true that there's never been a better time to have Parkinson's disease, and that's true for a lot of neurologic diseases. There are advances being made more quickly than has ever been the case in our history, and the smart money is on lots of significant breakthroughs in the next years, and I don't mean decades, but I mean handful of years, and smart people that work on these things that I know and trust to a person tell me that, and I believe it. But having smart, innovative, and curious people who work in tech fields really gives me a lot of hope. As I've said, the ability for technology to get even better at bringing us together as a community, bringing patients and healthcare providers together so that healthcare providers can know more about the illness that we live with, and the qualitative differences among people. Big data, we haven't talked about that, but big data has a real role to play as it is now, but even more importantly in the future, I think, with its ability to look at PD from more macro perspectives and find, genetic trends or environmental trends or both that give us more of a sense of how this illness starts and the course that it tends to take. And the final thing maybe that I'll mention that gives me a lot of hope is that I really believe that people are inherently good and generous and want to work on things, whether it be in technology or medicine or other fields that make a contribution to the public good. And I see that every day that I breathe and work at what I do, and that gives me a lot of hope and really a lot of excitement about what the future holds for me and for those I love who have Parkinson's, and for those that may be listening who are affected by this illness too.
So powerful, the journey that you've been on and the words you're sharing there. And there are people listening in 165 countries. And just to think of how much your words will mean to them is incredible, a credible use of technology as well. And we began this podcast today talking about your origin story. And I always like to finish on a lighter note and say, is there a song, piece of music, movie or book or anything, even an individual that has inspired or helped you in your career that you could share and maybe pass on to somebody listening?
I'm a writer of books and a reader of books, and I love books, so that would be easy. But what comes to mind sort of first, and I'll go with that, is the Crosby, Stills, and Nash song "Teach Your Children." If you know the words to that song, it's really about circles of life and learning, and ultimately about love. And that trifecta, if you will, inspires me in my career in teaching and writing. It guides me in my work in the Parkinson's community with education and advocacy. I think it's important as an educator to think about the power of teaching and learning, and something that we do hopefully our whole lives. And so I'll go with Teach Your Children by Crosby, Stills, and Nash.
That is a great tune, a beautiful reason behind it as well. So I'll be adding that to the Tech Talks Daily Spotify playlist so other people can listen to that. But before I let you go, for anyone that would like to reach out, find out more information about you and the work that you're doing, or even contact your team, what's the best starting point for that?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Neil. I have a blog that is very active, and I communicate with people through the blog. It's PDWise, PD as in Parkinson's disease, wise, WISE.com. You can follow me on Twitter at PDWise, on Instagram at PDWise blog, and then on Facebook at PDWise.
Well, I urge everyone to check out the blog there. There's so much valuable information. You've really got me thinking as well about the use of technology and big data. I never even thought about the usage of big data there. So I've learned a lot today. Cannot thank you enough. Hopefully next time I will see you or speak to you, I'll be sitting in Rudy's. I'll send a text message or a LinkedIn message and say, Alan, I'm waiting for you in Rudy's. Maybe that'll be the next time that we speak.
That would be great. I will buy you all the barbecue you can eat in Austin, Texas, Neil, if you come.
There's a lot of barbecue there, man. So, but thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Cheers.
So I've made Alan a promise to meet him in Austin, Texas for breakfast, tacos at Rudy's, maybe go to Black's at night. And I do plan on honouring that promise. He's an amazing, inspirational guy. And it's my hope that somebody is listening to this conversation somewhere in the world and have found a little hope. And they see how technology can help them and how Alan can help them too. So please drop by Alan's blog there at pdwise.com to connect with Alan. And if this episode has been helpful, please send me a message, techblogwriter@outlook.com, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, at Neil C. Hughes. And my website is techblogwriter.co.uk, where you'll find nearly 2,000 podcast interviews. But more than anything, just a big thank you for joining me today. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow. But thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.